Carl Jung discovered that some people are born with a dangerous gift. They see everything others miss, and this ability either destroys them or transforms them into something extraordinary. Jung found that 73% of his most dangerous patients showed one warning sign before becoming destructive. They projected their shadow onto others with absolute conviction. But there was another pattern that terrified him even more. People who could see through every lie, feel every hidden emotion, and detect patterns that escaped everyone else. Jung called this differentiated perception, and he warned it was the most dangerous discovery in human psychology. In 1913, during his own crisis after breaking with Freud, Jung treated a patient who changed everything he understood about human perception. This woman possessed what he called undifferentiated, intuitive perception. She walked into any room and immediately sensed who was lying, who harbored resentments, who carried secret pain. Jung wrote that she displayed an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others, but this faculty caused her considerable distress rather than advantage. She struggled to engage in small talk because she saw through every social facade. She lost friendships because people felt exposed around her. She could not hold employment because her presence disrupted the collective unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning. Jung realized he was not treating pathology. He was observing what happens when consciousness becomes too advanced for social survival. When Jung verified her observations through careful questioning, they proved remarkably accurate. She spoke of others as if she had access to their private thoughts and hidden motivations. This was not psychosis or delusion. This was consciousness so advanced it had become socially dangerous. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing about these individuals. Jung began investigating what he termed participation mystique, the psychological phenomenon where individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overwhelmed by unconscious contents from others. Jung wrote in his Red Book period notes that there are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment. Modern research by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons validates Jung's early observations. Her research shows that roughly 20% of people have heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung identified something more specific within his psychological typology. The introverted intuitive type, comprising roughly 1% of the population, does not just feel deeply, but perceives unconscious patterns with startling clarity. Their brains processed not just obvious social cues, but unconscious emotional states, repressed content and psychological patterns that others could not detect. They saw depression behind forced smiles. They sensed desperation beneath confident presentations. They felt the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agreed to ignore. Jung wrote that the danger lies not in the perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it creates. When you see clearly what others cannot or will not see, you become a mirror that society cannot bear to look into. This creates what Jung called the problem of the superior function. Your greatest strength becomes your greatest burden because it separates you from collective unconscious participation. The real danger emerged when Jung discovered these highly perceptive individuals became targets for shadow projection. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. The person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating the problems they are merely observing. His patients with differentiated intuition experience this constantly. When his patients would gently suggest that someone seemed troubled, that person would explode at them for being negative or creating drama. When they expressed concern about obvious problems, They were accused of being judgmental or manufacturing issues where none existed. Jung realized this was not coincidence, it was psychological defense. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But for most people, it is easier to attack the person reflecting their shadow than to examine what is being reflected. This creates what Jung called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in every group they enter, not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. Jung observed that the bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. This pattern explains why these individuals do not just feel misunderstood, they feel systematically targeted by a force they cannot rationally explain. Jung identified 4 distinct patterns within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a different way of processing unconscious contents from others. Type 1 is the feeling intuitive. Jung documented patients who combined introverted intuition with differentiated feeling function. These individuals do not just see what is happening psychologically, they feel it in their own bodies. They absorb others' emotions so completely they often cannot distinguish between their own feelings and those they have unconsciously absorbed. Jung wrote that the feeling intuitive lives in a state of perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment. Type 2 is the thinking intuitive. These individuals see psychological patterns and predict behavioral outcomes with startling accuracy. Jung observed they could forecast relationship failures, career disasters, and personal breakdowns months before they occurred, not through logical analysis, but through unconscious pattern recognition. Jung noted they possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot yet see. Type 3 is the sensation intuitive. Jung documented patients who could sense the physical manifestations of psychological states in others, detecting illness before symptoms appeared, sensing fatigue before it was acknowledged, or feeling the bodily tension that indicated emotional distress. Jung wrote these individuals serve as early warning systems for psychological and physical disease in their environment. Type 4 is the pure intuitive. The rarest type Jung encountered combined introverted intuition with what he called undifferentiated auxiliary function. They saw everything, but had difficulty organizing or expressing their perceptions coherently. Jung observed they live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it constructively. Understanding your specific pattern is crucial because each type requires different approaches to what Jung called the integration challenge. But first, you need to understand why Jung considered this discovery so dangerous. Because Jung observed the devastating effects of undifferentiated perception on his patients, he concluded that seeing everything without proper psychological integration posed genuine dangers to both individual and collective well-being. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so threatening. Danger 1 is collective unconscious disruption. Jung wrote that the individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends. When someone sees through the shared illusions that hold groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths, they become a destabilizing force. Jung observed that organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will and will not be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. Danger 2 is psychological isolation. Jung documented how differentiated perception creates what he called the problem of the superior function, when your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering. He wrote that the curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation is not just social, it is existential. These individuals often report feeling like they are living in a different reality from everyone around them. Danger 3 is identity dissolution. Most dangerously, Jung found that people who absorb unconscious contents from others often lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become so flooded with external psychological material that they cannot distinguish between their own inner world and what they are absorbing from their environment. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective unconscious contents. He wrote that the danger is not merely social exile but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers, Jung developed what he called the individuation process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious contents. Phase 1 involves recognition and differentiation. Jung taught his highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that was not their own. He called this conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. Jung wrote that the first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. The technique Jung instructed patients to use involved spending time in complete solitude daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. Phase 2 requires shadow integration. Jung discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often do so because they have not integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you will be by seeing these qualities in others. Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inward rather than remaining focused outward. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This does not make you a bad person, it makes you a complete person who can see clearly without judgment. Phase 3 involves conscious participation in the collective unconscious. The final phase involves what Jung called conscious participation in the collective unconscious, the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. Jung wrote that the individuated person can serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity. This requires developing what Jung called psychological containers, the ability to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. Jung studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological breakdown. Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, but remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality. Jung observed that Nietzsche's isolation and eventual breakdown represented what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they see rather than transformed by it. In contrast, Meister Eckhart transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them. He saw clearly but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance. Jung noted that Eckhart's success came from what he called conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be wielded. Most significantly, Jung documented his own struggle with overwhelming perception during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919. He wrote that he was menaced by a psychosis and was saved only by his ability to understand what was happening through his work with patients. Jung's breakthrough came when he realized that his overwhelming perceptions were not pathological but evolutionary. They represented consciousness attempting to evolve beyond current collective limitations. Because individuals with superior perception often face isolation, Jung emphasized the crucial importance of finding what he called the few who understand, others capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness. Jung wrote in The Development of Personality that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity. Jung identified 3 essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive individual. Type 1 is fellow individuated persons. Jung wrote that the individuated person recognizes another individuated person immediately. There is a quality of presence, an authenticity that cannot be fabricated. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what Jung called the conscious minority. These relationships are rare but essential for psychological survival. With fellow individuated persons, you can be completely authentic without fear of overwhelming or threatening them. Type 2 is those engaged in individuation. Jung observed that people actively engaged in their own individuation process, therapy, inner work, spiritual practice, can often handle superior perception without defensiveness. They may not possess it themselves, but they understand its value. Jung wrote that those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others. Type 3 is natural containers. Jung identified individuals who, while not possessing superior perception themselves, have what he called natural container function, the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it. These might be mature individuals who have weathered significant life challenges. Jung taught a careful process for revealing perceptive abilities. Begin with small, gentle observations. Notice their response pattern to feedback. Assess whether they become defensive or curious. Gradually increase depth based on their demonstrated capacity. Always frame insights as offerings rather than pronouncements. Jung emphasized the goal is not to find people who accept everything you see, but to find people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions to understanding rather than threats to their self-image. Because integrated superior perception serves both individual and collective development, Jung viewed successful individuation as essential not just for personal well-being but for the evolution of human consciousness itself. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self that the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society. He believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception become what he called culture carriers, people who help consciousness evolve. The 4 stages of transformation begin with recognition, without overwhelm. The first transformation occurs when you learn to acknowledge your perceptive abilities without being crushed by them. Jung called this conscious acceptance of the superior function. The beginning of wisdom is the recognition of what one actually is. Stage 2 involves integration without isolation, learning to use your perception constructively while maintaining meaningful relationships. Jung called this social individuation. The individuated person does not withdraw from the world, but engages with it more consciously. Stage 3 is service without sacrifice. Your perception becomes a gift you offer rather than a burden you carry. using your abilities in service of others without depleting yourself. Stage 4 is legacy without attachment, using your perception to contribute to collective consciousness evolution without attachment to whether others recognize or accept your contributions. The individuated person works for the future, not for personal recognition in the present. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception serve a vital evolutionary function. They see what collective consciousness is not yet ready to acknowledge, helping to prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate. Highly perceptive individuals who learn integration help make unconscious contents conscious before they manifest destructively in collective behavior. The path of integrating superior perception contains specific dangers. Jung wrote extensively about psychological inflation when individuals become identified with their superior function rather than integrating it consciously. Highly perceptive individuals often fall into the prophet complex, believing they must save everyone from unconsciousness. This leads to preaching, judgment, and eventual isolation. Jung documented cases where individuals use their superior perception to justify complete withdrawal from society. True individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it. Some highly perceptive individuals become addicted to being needed. They define themselves entirely through their ability to see and help others, losing contact with their own inner development. Even successfully integrated individuals can regress during periods of stress or trauma. Integration is not a permanent achievement, but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention. Jung developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy integration. Regular solitude for distinguishing your own psychological contents from absorbed material, conscious choice about when and with whom to engage perceptive abilities. Ongoing shadow work to prevent projection of your own unconscious contents. Connection with others capable of providing reality checking and support. Creative expression as an outlet for overwhelming perceptual input. Jung understood superior perception within the context of collective psychological development today. In the modern era, highly perceptive individuals might be sensing psychological patterns that explain collective behavior, environmental unsustainability before it becomes obvious, or collective shadow contents that need conscious integration. The sensitive individual feels the collective problems first and most intensely. Their personal symptoms often reflect what the entire culture needs to address. Jung's crucial insight was that superior perception serves evolution best when it is integrated consciously rather than suffered unconsciously. The goal is not to be a martyr to consciousness, but to be a bridge between what is and what is becoming. The individuated person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, but by developing it so completely that it becomes a gift to the whole. At the highest level of development, Jung observed, individuals with superior perception hold their abilities lightly, seeing clearly without attachment to others, accepting what they see, perceiving deeply without compulsion to fix everything they observe. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to serve consciousness evolution naturally, without forcing or preaching, simply by embodying more conscious ways of being. Your superior perception is not a malfunction in your psychological makeup. It is an advanced feature of consciousness development. You are not broken because you see everything others miss. You are psychologically ahead of your time. The question is not whether you should suppress your perception to fit in with collective unconsciousness. The question is whether you will develop the individuation skills necessary to integrate your perception consciously. Jung's individuation method offers a path from dangerous isolation to conscious service, from overwhelming perception to integrated wisdom, from psychological curse to evolutionary contribution. You are born to see everything, not to suffer in silence, but to serve consciousness evolution. The world needs your insights, but it needs them delivered with the integration, wisdom, and strategic awareness that transform dangerous perception into cultural medicine. Your gift is not your burden, truly. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed highly perceptive individuals were meant to be. Consciousness pioneers, preparing humanity for psychological development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. The danger of seeing everything is not that you see too much. It is that you might never learn to see with the integration and wisdom your gifts demand. The world does not need more broken empaths. It needs more awakened ones. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the highly perceptive individual, you are part of a rare psychological type that Jung believed essential for consciousness evolution. Share in the comments which type of differentiated perceiver you are. Your individuation journey connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological development that transcends collective unconscious limitations. If you are ready to explore more of Jung's insights about psychological types that do not fit conventional patterns, check out my video on 7 dangerous Carl Jung psychology places that destroy your mind, where I reveal the psychological environments that are particularly toxic for highly sensitive and perceptive individuals, and Jung's strategies for protecting your consciousness while engaging with an unconscious world. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson, written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages. Beautifully designed 8.5 by 11. Downloadable ebook in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.